She was 20 years old, penniless, and carrying her father's name like a stone in her pocket, because in the town where she'd been raised, that name meant thief. Her uncle, Warren Dodge, had told her plainly that he could no longer shelter the daughter of a disgraced man under his roof. Not with a hardware business and a reputation to protect. And he had handed her $11 as if it were an act of great generosity. With most of that money spent on passage west, she would pay $2 for a section of gullied, useless land outside a Colorado mining town. A place so cursed by old scandal that no one else would touch it. Ground that held nothing, she was told, but sagebrush and a ravine full of rotted timber. The wreck of an old stagecoach lay half buried down in that ditch, exactly where it had crashed 15 years before, and folks mocked her openly when she announced she meant to drag it out. What none of them knew, what had been bolted to that coach's ruined floor since the night it went into the ravine, was a strongbox that would clear her father's name, uncover the true thief who had let him hang for it in the town's memory, and give an entire community back something it had been waiting 15 years to receive. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Josephine Larkin, if a name from your own family's past has ever followed you somewhere you didn't choose to go. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and settle in. Because this one takes a little time to tell right. Josephine Larkin had spent the first 10 years of her life in Cedar Bend, Missouri, in a small clapboard house set back from the road behind her father's stable yard, where the smell of horse liniment and hay dust hung in the air as familiar as breathing. Her father, Nathaniel Larkin, drove coach for the Continental Overland Express, one of the company's most trusted men, chosen again and again for the long, dangerous runs through the mountain passes because he had a gift for reading horses and weather both. A calm hand that could talk a spook team down off a narrow grade in a thunderstorm, and a memory for every rut and washout on 300 miles of road. Her mother, Sarah, kept the house and the small garden behind it, and taught Josephine her letters from a worn primer at the kitchen table, her voice patient even when Josephine's small fingers smudged the ink. It was a modest, contented household, built on the particular rhythm of a family whose father was gone for days at a time and treasured, all the more on the evenings he was home, when he would swing Josephine onto his knee at the supper table and tell her, in the plain, unhurried way he told everything, about the country he'd crossed that week, the elk he'd seen on a ridge at dawn, the creek that had risen too high to ford until he'd found the old crossing 2 miles upstream that nobody else remembered. From her father, Josephine learned more than stories. She learned the discipline of a man who took his obligations seriously, who checked his harness twice before a run and never once, in all his years driving, lost a passenger or a parcel to carelessness. She learned to read a horse's ears and the set of its shoulders for fear before it showed in its feet, to keep her voice low and even in the presence of animals that trusted low, even voices, and to understand that a driver's real cargo, more than any strongbox or mail sack, was the trust of everyone who climbed into his coach, believing he would get them safely to the other end of the road. He taught her, too, without ever quite saying it outright, that a man's word was the only thing of his that could not be taken from him by force, only given away by his own hand, and that giving it away, even under pressure, even to save himself, was a thing he would never do. She did not fully understand, at 8 or 9 years old, how much that lesson would come to matter. She only knew that she loved him, plainly and completely, the way a child loves a parent who is steady. And that Cedar Bend, small and unremarkable as it was, felt to her like the safest place in the world. She remembered, too, the particular smell of the stable yard at dusk when her father came home from a run, the mingled scent of trail dust and sweat-lathered horses and the leather of his driving gloves, and the way he would crouch down to her height before he'd even washed the road from his hands, asking her first, always first, before any greeting to her mother or any word about the run itself, whether she had minded her letters that week, It was a small ritual, easily overlooked, but Josephine understood even then that it told her something true about the order of things in her father's heart. And she carried that small certainty forward through every hard year that followed. The way a traveler carries a compass whose needle has never once, in her experience, pointed wrong, her mother's death came first. A lung fever that settled into her chest one hard winter and would not lift, taking her in the space of a month when Josephine was 11. Nathaniel Larkin grieved in the quiet, contained way of a man who had built his whole life around steadiness. And he leaned harder into his work after that, taking the long western runs more often, the ones that kept him away 2 and 3 weeks at a stretch, because an empty house was a harder thing to sit in than a coach box in bad weather. Josephine was sent to stay with her father's brother, Warren Dodge, and his wife in the town of Millbank, 20 miles east, whenever her father's roots kept him too long from home. And she grew used to the rhythm of it. 3 weeks with her uncle's family, then a joyful reunion, then 3 weeks again. It was not the life she would have chosen, but it was bearable, because she always knew her father would return, dusty and tired and smelling of the road, swinging her up exactly the way he always had. Then, in the autumn Josephine turned 13, everything came apart at once, in a manner so sudden and so total that she would spend the better part of the next 7 years trying to understand it. Her father's coach, on the long run west out of a mining settlement called Split Rock in the Colorado Territory, carrying a Strongbox that held both the express company's payroll and a special, charitable fund the mining district had raised over 2 years to build the territory's first proper schoolhouse and church, a fund every miner and merchant in the district had contributed to out of his own hard-earned wages, was set upon by armed men on a stretch of narrow mountain road above a steep ravine. In the chase and gunfire that followed, the coach went off the grade and overturned into the ravine below, and by the time a search party reached the wreckage 2 days later, the Strongbox was gone, the horses scattered, and Nathaniel Larkin nowhere to be found, either dead in the brush or, as the express company's chief agent insisted with growing certainty over the following weeks, fled west with the very men who had robbed him. A driver who had betrayed the trust of an entire mining district for a share of its own charity money. It was, Josephine would learn much later, a monstrous lie. But at 13 years old, in Millbank, Missouri, she knew only what the newspapers printed and what her uncle told her in a voice thick with shame. That her father was gone, presumed either dead or a fugitive, and that the name Larkin was now spoken in 2 counties as a byword for betrayal. Warren Dodge, who ran a modest hardware business and depended on the goodwill of his customers, bore the disgrace as though it were a debt levied directly against him. And though he did not turn Josephine out that year, something in the household shifted permanently, a coolness that settled over every mention of her father's name, an unspoken understanding that she was, from that day forward, a guest tolerated rather than a niece beloved. Her aunt, a nervous, deferential woman named Prudence, who rarely contradicted her husband on any matter, took to addressing Josephine with a careful, distant politeness, the sort extended to a lodger whose rent was uncertain, and the younger cousins, taking their cue from their father's discomfort, grew quietly, unthinkingly cold toward her in turn, without any of them, perhaps entirely understanding why. Josephine grew up in that coolness for 7 years, keeping her uncle's account books with the same careful precision her father had once applied to his harness leather, mending her cousin's clothes by lamplight with her mother's old sewing kit, asking for nothing beyond her keep, and waiting, though she could not have said for what, because some stubborn, unyielding part of her had never once believed the story the newspapers told about her father. The end came on a gray morning 3 weeks after Josephine's 20th birthday, when Warren Dodge called her into the small office behind his hardware counter, did not ask her to sit, and told her, in the flat voice of a man settling an unpleasant obligation, that a niece of legal age with no prospects of marriage was a burden his business could no longer justify carrying, particularly a niece whose surname still occasionally drew a customer's raised eyebrow. He set $11 on the counter, the remainder, he explained, of a small sum her father had left in trust years before, minus the cost of her keep since. Josephine did not argue. She had learned there was no arguing with her uncle's ledgers. She took the money, gathered what little was hers: her mother's sewing kit, a single spare dress, and her father's old leather driving gloves, cracked with age but still smelling faintly of oiled leather and horse, the one object of his she had kept through every year of his absence. And she walked out of Millbank without a backward glance, carrying inside her the quiet, unspoken conviction that had never once left her, that wherever the truth of what happened to her father actually lay, it was not in Missouri, and if she meant to find it, or even simply to build some kind of life beyond the shadow of his name, she would have to go west. Toward the place where the story had begun, she traveled for the better part of a month. First by rail as far as her money allowed, then by whatever wagon or freight outfit would take on a paying passenger, watching the green hills of Missouri give way slowly to the drier, harder country of the high plains and then the first rising folds of the Colorado mountains. She arrived at last in the mining town of Split Rock itself, the very settlement her father's ill-fated coach had departed from 15 years before. A town that had grown considerably since then on the strength of a played-out but once rich silver vein. Now a cluster of some 60 buildings along a single main street, backed by steep timber-bird slopes. She arrived with barely $4 in her pocket and the particular numb determination of a woman who understood she had nowhere left to retreat to. She did not tell anyone at first whose daughter she was. The town's land office was a narrow building at the street's far end, and inside it she found a heavy-set, sun-weathered clerk named Eli Bramwell, who looked her over with the weary patience of a man who had turned away 100 hopeful strangers and expected to turn away one more. She told him she needed land, however poor, that she could work or at least shelter on, because she had almost nothing left to spend. Bramwell laughed, not unkindly, and told her that every worthwhile parcel in the district had been claimed decades ago by mining interests, save for a single ragged section out past the old stage road, a stretch of gullied hillside and ravine that the county had held in forfeiture for years and could not give away, because it was the very stretch of ground where the Larkin robbery, as everyone still called it, had ended in blood and wreckage a decade and a half before. Folks considered it unlucky, Bramwell said, and worse. The wrecked coach itself was still down in the ravine, too heavy and too tangled in fallen timber for anyone to have bothered hauling it out over the years. He could release the deed to her, he said, for the cost of the filing, which came to $2. Josephine set the coins on his counter without a flicker of hesitation, and did not mention, as she took the paper naming her the owner of 40 acres of ravine and ruin, that Larkin was the very name stitched into the story he had just told her. She walked out to the section that same afternoon, following Bramwell's crude map, along a rutted track that climbed steadily above the town before dropping toward a steep-sided ravine choked with brush and deadfall. She found the wreck almost exactly where she expected it, a dark hulk of splintered wood and rusted iron fittings half swallowed by 15 years of blown soil and creeping sagebrush, one wheel still upright and skeletal against the sky. The coach's body canted at a broken angle where it had come to rest against a boulder at the ravine's bottom. She stood at the rim looking down at it for a long time, the wind pulling at her skirt, feeling something she could not entirely name. Grief and recognition and a strange, fierce curiosity all tangled together, because this was, in every sense that mattered, the last place her father had ever stood as an honest man in the eyes of the world. The following morning she climbed down into the ravine with a coil of rope, a mattock borrowed on credit from the town's blacksmith, and the plain stubborn intention of seeing, with her own eyes, exactly what remained of the wreck her father had supposedly abandoned in disgrace. It took her the better part of 3 days simply to clear enough brush and fallen timber to see the coach's frame plainly. Days of raw hands and aching shoulders, the mountain sun burning the back of her neck while jays scolded her from the scrub pines above. And on the third afternoon, working her way along the coach's collapsed underside, she found what the years of newspaper accounts and second-hand gossip had never once mentioned. Bolted directly to a reinforced section of the coach's floor, half buried under packed silt and rotted planking, was the express company's Strongbox, rusted solid, still fastened by its iron mounting straps exactly as it had been the night the coach went into the ravine. It took her another full day, working with the mattock and a length of pry bar, to free the box from its mounts without damaging whatever lay inside. And when she finally hauled it up out of the ravine on a rope and rested it in the shade of a scrub pine, her hands were shaking, not entirely from the effort. The lock had rusted to the point of uselessness, and it took only a few sharp blows with the mattock to spring it open. Inside, wrapped against the years of damp and oiled canvas that had mostly held, she found 2 things: a modest sum of coin and paper currency, water-stained but intact, considerably less than the full payroll the newspapers had once claimed was stolen, and a thick folded packet of documents, protected at the center of the bundle, that had survived the 15 years nearly untouched. The topmost document, written in her father's own careful, familiar hand, made her breath catch so hard she had to sit down in the dirt. It was dated the very day of the robbery, written, from what she could piece together, in the frantic minutes after the coach had gone into the ravine and before whatever happened next had happened. To whoever reads this, it began, "If I do not survive what is coming, know that I am Nathaniel Larkin, driver of this coach, and I am innocent of whatever story is told about tonight." Her father went on to explain, in the plain, unhurried hand she remembered from years of household ledgers, that the ambush had not been a chance robbery by outside men at all, but had been arranged from within the express company itself, by its own regional agent, a young, ambitious man named Augustus Kane, who had spent the better part of a year quietly diverting portions of the district's charitable school fund into his own accounts and had engineered the holdup to cover the shortfall, intending for the entire Strongbox, and the evidence of his theft along with it, to disappear over the ravine's edge along with the coach. Nathaniel wrote that he had discovered the discrepancy in the ledgers weeks earlier, had confronted Kane privately, and had been assured the matter would be quietly corrected before any inspection uncovered it. Instead, he wrote, "I believe now that Kane arranged this night to silence me and bury his theft at once. And if I do not survive it, I want it known that I never took $1 that was not mine, and that the men who profit from tonight's wreck are not the poor souls who might be blamed for it in the newspapers, but the man who is, at this very hour, likely reporting the robbery to the company." With great sorrow in his voice, beneath the letter lay a second document, a partial ledger page in a different hand entirely, showing a pattern of withdrawals against the school and church funds account over the preceding year, each one initialed AK, each one falling suspiciously short of the fund's stated public contributions. Josephine sat in the dirt at the ravine's edge with the papers in her lap for a long while after she finished reading, the mountain wind cooling the sweat on her neck, understanding with a slow, settling clarity that she was no longer simply a penniless woman clearing brush from a worthless ravine. She was holding, in her own 2 hands, the proof that could undo 15 years of disgrace laid unjustly on her father's name, and the name Augustus Kane, mentioned nowhere in the newspaper she had ever read, was about to become the center of her life in Split Rock. It did not take her long to learn who Augustus Kane had become. He was no longer a young express agent, but the district's most prominent citizen, owner of the largest bank in Split Rock and 2 others in neighboring towns, A man whose name appeared on the town hall's cornerstone and whose considerable fortune built, it was widely believed, on shrewd early investments in mining claims, funded half the civic improvements the district had seen in the past decade. He was, in short, precisely the kind of man whose word would be believed instantly and whose accusation, once made, no one in Split Rock would think to question. Josephine understood immediately that walking into town waving 15-year-old papers and declaring herself the daughter of the notorious Larkin robbery would accomplish nothing but her own swift removal from the district, likely at Kane's own quiet instruction. She moved carefully instead. She found lodging in a small rented room above the town's dressmaker's shop, paid for with the recovered coin from the Strongbox, and she began, in patient conversations over the following weeks, to seek out the handful of people old enough to remember the district as it had been 15 years before. She found Amos Ridley, the town's blacksmith, a broad, taciturn man who had shod horses for the express line back when Nathaniel Larkin drove for it, and who remembered the driver as a careful, honest man entirely unlike the picture the newspapers had painted. A man who once rode 2 hours out of his way in a spring storm to bring word to a rancher's wife that her husband's freight wagon had broken an axle rather than let her worry through the night not knowing why he hadn't returned. She found Constance Meyer, an elderly widow whose late husband had been one of the original subscribers to the school and church fund, who still kept, tucked in a family Bible, her husband's handwritten receipt for the very donation the ledger page implicated Kane in diverting. A small yellowed slip of paper that Constance produced with trembling hands, saying she had wondered for years why the school promised to her husband's memory had never once broken ground. And she found eventually Sheriff Tobias Reed, a deliberate, careful man who had been a young deputy at the time of the robbery and who admitted to Josephine, in a low voice on his own porch after she had shown him her father's letter, that certain details of the original investigation had always troubled him, chiefly the speed and confidence with which Kane had insisted, in the days after the wreck, that the driver himself must be a conspirator, well before any physical evidence had been examined, and chiefly, too, the fact that Kane had personally supervised the disposal of the wrecked coach's contents rather than allowing the district's own appointed inspector to do so, a irregularity Reed had noted at the time and had never been able to explain to his own satisfaction. It was inevitable that word would reach Augustus Kane that a young woman had taken possession of the old Larkin ravine section and had been asking careful questions about a robbery most of the town preferred to forget. He came to see her himself on a cool autumn afternoon, arriving at her rented room in a fine dark coat with the unhurried confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and he was, at first, all warm concern, expressing sympathy for the hardship of her father's disgrace and offering, with an ease that made her skin prickle, to purchase her worthless ravine section outright for a sum considerably more generous than $2, out of what he called simple Christian charity toward a stranger fallen on hard times. Josephine understood precisely what the offer represented, an attempt to remove her, and whatever she might have found in that ravine, from Split Rock before either became a problem. She declined politely, telling them only that she had grown fond of the land and did not intend to sell. Something behind Kane's eyes went cold and careful at that, though his voice remained perfectly courteous, and he told her, before he left, that a young woman with no family and no standing in a town like Split Rock ought to consider very carefully how quickly circumstances could turn difficult. For someone unwelcome, the pressure that followed was the particular kind available to a man who owned the town's largest bank and half its commerce. The dressmaker who had rented Josephine her room suddenly discovered she needed it for a relative. The general store, when she came to buy supplies, found its prices for her purchases alone had risen without explanation. A freight driver she had arranged to hire to help haul what remained of the wrecked coach's iron fittings out of the ravine failed to appear, and admitted later, shamefaced, that he had been quietly warned off the job. Even the small subscription library above the assay office, where Josephine had gone hoping to find old district newspapers from the year of the robbery, discovered its back copies from that particular season had been misplaced and could not, for the moment, be located, a coincidence the elderly librarian reported with a tight, apologetic unease that told Josephine everything she needed to know about who had asked the favor. Josephine bore each obstacle without complaint. The way her father's letter had taught her a man, or a woman, ought to bear pressure meant to silence the truth. Finding a widow willing to let her a smaller room, buying her supplies a little further afield, doing the remaining ravine work herself. But when the strongbox itself, which she had foolishly left overnight in a shed behind her lodging, while she searched for a safer place to keep it, was found the next morning pried open and rifled through, though nothing of consequence remained inside for the intruder to take, she understood that the warning had escalated from words to action, and that she could no longer afford to wait quietly for the truth to reveal itself on its own schedule. That same night, by lamplight, she wrote out a full and careful account of everything the strongbox had contained. Her father's letter transcribed word for word, the ledger pages' dates and initials laid alongside what Constance Meyer's husband's receipt could independently confirm, and the pattern of quiet pressure that had followed her arrival in Split Rock. And the next morning she carried both the account and the original documents directly to Sheriff Tobias Reed, along with Amos Ridley and Constance Meyer as witnesses to what they themselves remembered and could verify. Reed, who had carried his own quiet doubts about the case for 15 years, moved with a deliberation that surprised even Josephine, sending word that same week to the Territorial Marshal's office and to the Express Company's regional headquarters, requesting a formal review of the original robbery investigation in light of new physical evidence recovered from the wreck itself. The inquiry, when it convened 3 weeks later in the crowded back room of the Split Rock Land Office, drew nearly every longtime resident of the district, many of whom had contributed, decades before, to the very school and church fund the strongbox had once carried. And the room was so full that latecomers stood pressed against the back wall and craned to see past the doorway. Augustus Kane arrived with a lawyer and an expression of confident, faintly amused patience, clearly certain the proceedings would collapse under the weight of his reputation alone. That confidence did not survive the reading of Nathaniel Larkin's letter aloud in his own hand, nor the moment when Constance Meyer produced her husband's 15-year-old receipt and laid it directly beside the ledger page's dates, showing a subscription that had somehow never appeared in full in the fund's official records. Kane's lawyer argued that a dead man's letter, however sincere, proved nothing on its own. But the Territorial Marshal's clerk, sent to examine the Express Company's surviving old account books in the regional office, returned within the week with confirmation that the very withdrawal pattern described in the recovered ledger page-matched entries still present, faded but legible in the company's own historical records, entries that had simply never been cross-examined because no one, in 15 years, had thought to look, faced with evidence that no longer relied solely on a dead man's word. Augustus Kane's carefully built reputation began to unravel with a speed that startled even those who had long harbored private doubts about him. Depositors, once word spread through the district, quietly began withdrawing their funds from his bank. The Territorial Marshal opened a formal investigation into the original theft and the 15-year-old false accusation against Nathaniel Larkin. And though Kane fled the territory before any warrant could be served, taking what remained of his liquid fortune with him, the bank itself, stripped of its principal owner and its public trust in the same season, was forced into a quiet, orderly dissolution, its remaining assets absorbed by a more modest institution, willing to honor its depositors in full. The man who had built his fortune on another man's stolen name spent the rest of his years, so far as Split Rock ever learned, a stranger in some distant territory. His name never again spoken aloud in the town he had once ruled by reputation alone. Asterisk. Josephine Larkin did not seek to enrich herself from what remained of the recovered Strongbox, nor from the modest settlement the express company's regional office eventually offered informal acknowledgement of her father's wrongful disgrace. Instead, working alongside Sheriff Reed and the district's remaining old subscribers, she used the recovered funds, together with a public subscription the town itself took up once the truth of the original charitable fund became known, to finally build the schoolhouse and small chapel the district had been promised 15 years before and had long since stopped expecting. A modest timber building raised on a rise above the main street where every child in Split Rock, miner's daughter and merchant's son alike, could learn their letters the way Josephine once had at her own mother's kitchen table. Amos Ridley forged the iron door hinges himself, refusing any payment for the work, and Constance Meyer sewed the curtains for the schoolroom windows from bolts of calico she had been saving, she said, for exactly such an occasion without ever quite knowing why. On the cornerstone, at Josephine's quiet insistence and over the mild objection of a building committee that wanted her own name honored instead, was carved a simple inscription, erected in memory of the district's original charitable subscribers and of Nathaniel Larkin, driver, who kept his word. In the second spring after she had arrived in Split Rock with $4 to her name and a stranger's grief for a father she still believed innocent, Josephine Larkin stood on the rise above the schoolhouse in the pale morning light, watching the first children file through its new door, and she thought of the wrecked coach still resting, empty now in the ravine below, its work finally fully done. She thought of her father, who had written his innocence in a shaking hand in the last frightened minutes he believed he had left in the world, trusting that hand and that truth to a strongbox and a ravine, rather than to the mercy of men who might have silenced him instead. She thought, too, of her Uncle Warren Dodge, who had once set $11 on a counter and called his obligation discharged, believing the Larkin name a debt with no possible return, never imagining that the niece he cast out with almost nothing would one day clear that very name in front of an entire district, and build from a wreck everyone else had left to rot. The one thing her father's disgrace had denied a generation of children in Split Rock. Josephine Larkin had been 20 years old, penniless, and carrying a disgraced name. When she paid $2 for a ravine nobody wanted and dragged a 15-year-old wreck out of the brush because she could not make herself walk past it, it was, in the end, the truest inheritance her father ever left her. Not the coin still sealed inside that rusted strongbox, but the plain, unshakable insistence, written in his own hand at the worst hour of his life, that a person's word, once given honestly, was worth defending even from the bottom of a ravine, even after 15 years, even when the whole world had already decided the story was finished. She kept his old driving gloves on a shelf above the schoolhouse door ever after, not as a relic of grief, but as a small, quiet reminder to every child who passed beneath them that a name once cleared could carry a family a very long way forward. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Josephine's story tonight. If a tale like this one moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that an old, forgotten name can still be worth defending. And we would love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us, if you can, has there ever been something in your own family's past, mocked or dismissed by others, that you knew in your heart deserved a second look? We read every single comment, and we are always glad to know where in the world you are joining us from tonight. Until next time, stay close and keep faith with the quiet truths worth digging up. Asterisk.